Okay, so now that we know that the method or the Ajax method is working as part of our jQuery library that we've put on the page, we can now go ahead and start to pass some data through to the Ajax method. So what we're first of all going to do is we're going to create a file on our server, and we're just going to create a simple text file with some contents in, and we're going to see what happens when we try and Ajax to this file and return the contents. So within this video we're going to look at hitting this specific file. We're going to implement a success callback, which sounds more difficult than it is, so don't worry. And when that success callback runs, we're then going to read the contents of the file, and we're going to output them to the console like we've already seen. We're then also going to look at catching any failures. So at this stage it's important to realize that files can fail. You can have a failure to hit a file, and you need to sort of handle that in some kind of way. So here what we're going to do is we're just going to create a simple text file. So I'm going to create a new file in my text editor, and I'm just going to say this is a file. I'm going to go ahead and save this as file.txt. You can put it in a different folder if you want, as long as it's accessible through this file that we're working with here, index.html. Now, one thing to bear in mind before we continue, if I jump over to my browser, you'll see that I'm using localhost to do everything I'm doing here. Now, if you're not using localhost, and if you're writing the contents of this file and just opening them in your browser, you may find that you get issues through basically cross-origin requests. So what that means is, let's say I am working on a specific domain and I want to Ajax to a different domain to retrieve a file content. Now traditionally you won't be able to do this. There are ways of doing it, but we're not going to be covering that. Really, 99% of the time you're going to want to Ajax to files that are stored on your server, and that's fine because the domain's the same, and most browsers will handle this and let you do this. You have to remember that this functionality works client side, so it works within the browser to actually go ahead, retrieve the file, and make that HTTP request to that file, whether it's sending data or just retrieving. So what happens in the case of working locally is you actually tend to find that you get problems when you're accessing files. So my advice at this stage would be to simulate what you do on a normal server. So install Apache and work off localhost, and there are plenty of tutorials available to help you get up and running like this. But just something to bear in mind, because errors do occur if you're just working with files that you're simply opening inside of your browser. Okay, so with that explained, let's go ahead and hit this file.txt file, make an HTTP request to this file. Now what I'm going to do is, within the Ajax method, we already established that this works. I'm going to create an object. I'm just going to come down one line. So we've got an object here, and this is a JavaScript object that we can now include properties and values within. This will be passed to the Ajax method. That will basically take into account the settings that we pass through, and then we'll be able to actually use this functionality via callbacks or anything like that. So the first and probably most important thing we're going to look at is the URL property, and that's just a string. Now, you probably already guessed, it's just simply the URL of the thing that we want to send an HTTP request to, so the file. So in this case it's just file.txt. You don't need to specify anything like HTTP localhost / whatever. You can just do file.txt. If it was stored in another folder, you could just do /file.txt, but this is basically just the path to the file that we want to Ajax to. Now let's go ahead and examine, without doing anything else, what happens here. So I'm hitting refresh in my browser, nothing is really being output, you can't see anything happening. What we're going to do is jump over to the network tab and see what's happened here. Now you can see when I refresh, what happens is we first of all hit the index.html file. This is the index.html file here, and we get back this sort of response here. So we know that that's the page we're currently looking at. So it's this page here. So that's the first thing that is hit within our network tab. The second thing we hit is jQuery, which we already know that we're loading in via Google hosted libraries from their content delivery network. Now the next thing we're hitting, because we've included the JavaScript here to do it, is file.txt, and you can see that we actually get the response back here. So you can see the preview and the response here. We can look at the headers as well. So we're using a get request method, which we'll speak a bit about later as well. And all of these headers here. So we've got some request headers being sent. And lastly, just something that jQuery loads in sort of via itself. So we don't really need to worry too much about that. The main thing we want to focus on is this here. Now what we can do down the bottom here inside of our network tab is filter the different types of requests. So let's click on documents and see what happens. Well, now we've filtered down to just document requests. What happens if we want to filter down to style sheets? Well, we haven't included any style sheets, so that's not the case. Or nothing will be here. What about scripts? Well, you can probably guess we got jQuery.min.js loaded in, because that is in fact a script that we're loading in from an external source. Now what's XHR? Well, basically this will be any Ajax requests that we load in. So in this case you can see that we've got file.txt here and jQuery.min.map, which is loaded in via jQuery itself. So again, we don't need to worry about that. But this here is an XHR request. We filtered down and we know that that's there. So if you've got a lot of other resources on your page being loaded in, and you sort of find that all filter a bit overwhelming, you might have, you shouldn't, but you might have, say, 100 requests coming in here. You can filter this down. Or if you've got things being loaded in on a timer, you can hit XHR and only focus on what's being loaded in, Ajaxed in every so often. So we know that we've now hit file.txt and it's been loaded in. The Ajax request is successful. The page didn't refresh when we wanted to actually retrieve this file. So we've successfully now actually Ajaxed in a file. Now what happens if we actually want to do something once this has been loaded in? Well, we have a success method here, or a success property, which allows for a callback, and this callback allows us to actually do something once this file's been successfully hit and loaded in. So in this case, I'm just going to console log works. I mean, we already know this works. We've looked at how this works and we've explained this. But when I go over to the console now, you see that works has been output, and that's because file.txt has been hit. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to file1.txt, and we'll see what happens. Now file1.txt does not exist, so therefore this success callback function will not be run, and we won't log the string works to the console. So when I go ahead and refresh now, and I head over to the console, instead of the work string being output, we get that there's a 404 error being returned on this file1.txt. And if we head over to our network tab, you can see that an XHR request or an Ajax request to this file has been attempted, but the status that returned is a 404, and that means it's not found. And you can see that the sort of server that we're running on has returned this as a response, and in the headers that will have returned a 404 as well. So in this case, what do we do? Well, we want to know that we can actually handle this error in case something doesn't work. So we use the error property, and again we can use a callback here, and we can go ahead and say console.log something went wrong. So in this case, we'll get that string output. If we head over to the console, it says here something went wrong. We're never going to get rid of this, but that's just the nature of it. With the ability to have a callback, we can at least do something if the file that we're Ajaxing to fails, because we want to maybe show something to the user, give the user some kind of message to let them know that it failed for some reason. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at actually grabbing the data from the file that we're Ajaxing to. So let's change this back to file.txt. Go ahead and just refresh our browser. We see that this works. We know that the file exists and that we get the correct response. Now we need a way to actually get the data back from the file so we can do something with it. So in this case, we're probably just going to log it to the console, but we might want to actually, do something, display the data to the user or something like that. So what we have is we have an argument or a parameter that we can specify within the callback via the success property, and that is data. And that basically is the contents of the file. Now you can call this whatever you want, D, data, contents, anything like that, but I tend to always just call it data. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to say console.log, and you've probably already guessed data. Now what's going to happen is the contents of this file, so the contents that we see within the network tab here, the response or the preview, we're going to actually take that and then output it to the console, because that data argument or property now contains the contents of the file, whether that be plain text as it is at the moment, or it might be a JSON object, or it might be XML. We can use jQuery to parse that and actually do something with it. So console.log data, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens. So refresh, head over to the console, and we see this is a file. So we now know that file.txt contains that value. We know we Ajax to that file, we return the data within this callback if there's a success, and then we console log the contents of that file. So that's worked really well. We now know that we can Ajax to this file, return the data within a success, handle errors, and actually see this working. We've also looked at some of the console as well within Chrome, just to see how we can actually look at what's being returned and check things, debug things, manipulate things from there. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at including some more friendly functionality here within the Ajax method of the jQuery library. We'll actually include maybe some buttons that we can click to actually return data from a specific file.